Welcome to What's Your Edge, a series of Vision Edge marketing podcasts dedicated to helping you use data, analytics, process, and measurement to create a competitive edge for you and a superior experience for your customers. I'm your host, Laura Patterson, President of Vision Edge Marketing. Today, I am joined by Mark L. Vincent, a process consulting engineer and Metasystems convener with more than 30 years of service as an executive advisor and corporate board member. He has been a pioneer in the space, and he currently serves on the boards of Century Companies and the Center of Steward Studies. Whoops, let me say that again. The Center of Steward Leader Studies, and chairs the board for MyGrow. Mark brings a wealth of expertise in driving customer-centric strategies at the C-suite and board level. What I admire most about Mark is his commitment to bridge the gap between executive leadership and boardroom strategy. Today, Mark and I are having a conversation about how boards of directors and members of the C-suite can collaborate effectively to align goals and accelerate growth through customer centricity. You all know that's one of my favorite topics. So Mark, thank you for being a part of today's conversation.
And I sure look forward to it.
And so does our community. So in our experience, the relationship between the C-suite and the board often determines the direction of the organization, whether that's a nonprofit or a profit. Boards have, become significantly more effective when they are equipped with what we call actionable insights derived from data. I mean, yeah, intuition and experience are really important for all of us, but today we also need to make decisions from data because this allows us to support strategy development and make faster decisions more confidently. So it's critical for driving innovation, excelling at meeting customer expectations, and remaining relevant, right, to our customers and in the market. So, Mark, as a board member, what kind of data do you need from members of the C-suite to help you make key strategic decisions?
Well, with you, Laura, I am a fan of data-informed decisions. And I love intuition, but I want intuition to be data-informed also. So sometimes strong leaders have to work backwards to gather the data so that they can refine what their intuition is telling them. But data will matter. And so I'm also a fan of the hard work that it takes to distill strategy into one-page plans. Big fan of one-page plans because then with an operating system that's distilled in this way and if the plan is distilled in this way and it's supported by the operating system, an example that's getting a lot of traction, that's a joke, traction is EOS and the book Traction, but the idea of that operating system supporting and reporting, excuse me, I'm gonna have to stop. My microphone just fell. So sorry.
No worries.
Let me get that back in place. I bumped it and it fell. Okay. Can I just start that answer again?
Of course you can.
Okay. I apologize. So Laura, I join you in being a fan of data-informed decisions and data-informed intuition. So some leaders actually have to work backwards from intuition to get data so that they can adjust what their gut is telling them and us. But what I want also to register here is that I'm a fan of that one-page plan that's supported by a strong operating system. An example of that today is EOS. So with EOS or any other form of operating system, that one-page plan helps to ask for data and direct the data so that it can go downward to workers, to vendors even, and upwards to a board. And you get transparent, accurate, and real-time data all of the time that you can look at and be able to use to direct the organization. And this has really helped if you have also like 12-month trailing financial indicators, dynamic budgets that are adjusted for 12 months, as well as where we're going in the future. And then the data can begin to reveal things in real time for everyone. Now, a lot of enterprises aren't doing this. They use a budget plan that they're updating once a year. They're looking at their financials at the end of the month, which are always 2 or 3 weeks late and inaccurate at that moment in time. And so that one-page plan supported by an operating system helps the board and executive, directors, employees, and again, even vendors be able to work in the same strategy, in the same kind of a sequence with transparency for what's really going on.
Mark, I agree with you. I am a huge fan of the one-page plan as well, which is why we actually created a SaaS application known as Excellence
There you go.
25 years ago. And what it allows people to do, and this is really important, is visually connect those investments and activities to business results, right? That's really the critical DNA that you've got to have. Anyway, speaking about data, a lot of organizations have more data today than ever before. Both of us have been around a long time. And in some ways, I think we were able to make better decisions way back when we weren't, being flooded, fire hosed by data. So the biggest challenge for a lot of organizations is to identify important patterns and signals, in order to figure out what it really means. So behind the data, what's the real meaning behind the data, so they know what action to take. So I have also found that one of the things that can be helpful in making that possible is to be able to tell good stories, to turn that data into a narrative that is going to resonate and be relevant to whomever is listening, right? In this case, we're talking about the board. So, Mark, how can C-suite executives prepare data-driven narratives that will speak to the board members' needs for operational resilience, financial performance, and of course, innovation?
There's a lot there in that question, and I can tell from reading some of what you've written and knowing what you're working on, you have a lot of experience in this area and a lot to say. And I really wish I could reverse the question and ask you how you would respond to it. But this is an area where I've done a lot of work, and I'm going to try to keep this pretty simple. An organization does have some kind of a budget plan, whether it's a 12-month trailing or a current one, and it's built out of what their business plan says. So, regardless of what the marketing message is, if I look at the budget, it tells me what the mission and the values are, because this is an indication of where it's directing time and money and people. And so that is a story. And I really suggest that executives turn that story into something that generates their report. Here's who we are, here's why we're working, and here's how we're using money, and here's how we're using people, and here's how we're using their time in order for this to happen. And so over the years, I've learned, especially as a board member, to look at the budget and to listen to the story. And if they are not the same, the real story is that budget. So I want to
Yes.
make sure that the data is matching the message, because the data is the real storyteller. And instead of having to unpack that and ask questions and analyze it, the boards will have their time made better use of, and the executives will raise their standing in the eyes of the board if they make the story and the money match up with accurate data.
Exactly. And I think an important point that you're making here, if I understand what you're saying, Mark, is that where you put your money tells you what your priorities are.
Right.
So, right? So, and it's really important to focus on the right priorities. So if you are saying X, but your money is going to Y, X is going to be a lot harder to achieve because it's not getting what it needs,
Right.
right? It's not getting the fuel that it needs. And I think somebody wrote a book around, priorities and, beginning with the end in mind and,
Yes,
first things first. And there's so many great books out there on that.
that's right.
So, a key role for the board is to ensure that the leadership team has those resources, support, and framework, and to support whatever the priorities are. And of course, for us, we believe one of the key priorities is got to be customer centricity, and that customer centricity is really about how you're going to run your company. Is the customer at the center of your decisions, at the center of your processes, at the center of your measures, all those things? Where does the customer fit? Because in today's world, the playing field's pretty level, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
so how you engage in delivering customer excellence is going to be a major differentiator. So what do you think is the board member's role in terms when it comes to oversight and alignment around customer centricity? Because obviously that's not their job to do day-to-day management. So if you think about, data like lifetime value and customer effort scores and customer retention and where does that come into the conversations with the board, and how does the board use measures like that to guide decisions and discussions around resources and priorities?
Yeah. I think this question really gets at that very fine line and distinction between the board's responsibility and an executive's responsibility. So, the way I like to slice that, and it's a very thin slice, is that the board of directors doesn't need to develop customer centricity, but it does need to expect it, maybe even demand it if it's not showing up, because then this drives the kind of analytical questions that they can ask, which is helpful for the current state and the future state of the organization. It also helps them to be supportive of the executive because the executive is giving them the information that they all need to be looking at together. So the governance and the operations are coming together at that board meeting as the executive makes their report and shows the data. And customer centricity is at the heart of it because this is the business driver. It's the customer purchases and it's the customer retention and it's the lifetime value of the customer that drives the ability to be in business next year also, and to complete the mission that you say that you're in the business to complete. And that's going to bring us right back to that narrative again. If you're spinning data and have a board that's asking these perceptive questions, you're not going to get away with it. And so you want the specific outline of where you're going to be matched with the financial data, again, starting with the customer behaviors and what's resulting in there. And I've been in a number of boardrooms where that attempt to game it so that it looks really good is exposed when the board starts to ask relevant questions about the data as it ties to the mission, and it's coming from their perception of what the financials are saying. And when that happens, then boards have very tough decisions to make. Can they grow this executive? Is the executive ready to adjust because they're learning? Or do they need to get a different executive, one who isn't gaming the system? Because in the end, it's about the customer's experience with the organization. Otherwise, you're not going to have a business in a year or two.
I obviously wholeheartedly agree with you, but I loved how you distinguish the difference between creating customer centricity versus expecting customer centricity. I love the fact that, yes, as members of the board, we should expect that the customer centricity, because after all, the purpose of a business is to create and serve a customer. So we would happen to believe, from our work, that we've been doing over the last 25 years, that customer centricity is essential to growth and it
Yeah.
needs to be integrated into the overall strategy. And so, it is a delicate balance. You talked about the slice being very thin at the board level, but it is definitely also a balance between those long-term strategic goals that the board's going to set and short-term performance demands, right? Every company's got to make those numbers. So how do having this balance helps ensure sustainable growth while meeting those near-term business needs, because you got to be able to pay your people, take care of your customers. So boards play a pretty pivotal role in this alignment, helping the leadership team prioritize the initiatives to get those immediate results and the long-term value. So, Mark, what do you recommend that the board does to enable this balance between the long-term strategic goals of customer centricity and short-term financial performance?
I really like the questions that you're putting out there today, Laura. And I have to say, this is probably my favorite one of them so far. And it's an opportunity to put a concept out there. So I'll try to be brief, but this I think is very pivotal. So when we talk about balance, there are two ways to understand that word, and they're both good. One is the idea that, well, we need to alternate between short term and long term. We move back and forth, kind of like an oscillating fan, doing the appropriate thing at appropriate times. That's all well and good because we don't want to neglect either one. But I really like a second perspective here, and that is that we don't oscillate so much as we expect both at the same time. We don't want to lose sight of either. We want to maintain our depth perception. So as we're making a short-term decision, it is in regard to the long term. And when we're making a long-term decision, we're not missing out on the short-term impacts. That's why we have to measure cash flow, because that is the kind of the mediator between those two. So let me use the example of triage at a medical catastrophe. Triage isn't just about quickly providing medical treatment in that particular moment. That would be just short term. It's about saving lives and as many as possible, which is a long term. And so, in that minute or those moments, you've got both of those converging in a highly sensitive time, a very dangerous time. Neither is cast aside, however. You're figuring out how can we do the most good for the longer term. Now, having described that, I'd like to offer perhaps another method. So in executive development, we want executives to think about long term, mid, and, or we might call that near term and short term. So when we say, when you put your plan together, let's think about what needs to happen now, what's going to have to happen across the next couple of years, and how does that help us over the longer term? Bring your proposals with that in mind. Don't leave them out. Otherwise, you're not doing executive work. You're doing operator work, entry level work. And so as an executive, you should be able to do that kind of short, middle, and long-term thinking. But it's not just that. It is also top and middle and bottom line financially. And so more and more when I'm helping executives develop as a board member or as an executive advisor, I'm putting that right in front of them. And I do it like a cross beam. So that left to right is short and middle and long term, and top to bottom is top, middle, and bottom line. So as you're putting this together, show the impacts as best as you can for all of those segments in that matrix. Now you have a fully examined issue as opposed to, oh, let's throw something at this, or, oh, we have to save money. And we're only thinking about this year's budget so that you get your comp and you get your bonus. And so it all looks good because that is only addressing one aspect of the complex dynamic. More and more, I am pushing harder on executives to get to this executive level of thinking where all of those impacts are examined from the beginning.
Excellent. And I agree with you. You need to be able to, it's like, I loved your metaphor of the uh, triage. I talk about driving a car fast. You want to be sure that you're not going to have a crash, but you need to be looking down the way, right? So there's a lot
That's
of
a
things
great,
that are going on. Similar idea. So
yes.
but I love your metaphor. So, a lot of board members, they've been in C-level roles before making their way to the boardroom, and making this shift from the leadership role to a board member position, it can be challenging for some of us, right? And so one of my favorite sayings is noses in and fingers out. And I think that's been attributed to Jim Brown, who wrote the book, The Imperfect Board Member. And he describes the ideal board member as staying informed and aware of the company's operations, noses in, while not interfering with the day-to-day management, fingers out. So building on this idea, Mark, how have you found serving on a board different from running a company or serving in the C-suite, since you've done all that? And how does the board's perspective need to differ from that of the C-suite executives, especially when you're thinking about customer
Yeah.
centricity?
Well, I really like the metaphor of the noses in and the fingers out. It creates a picture and you can begin to grasp it. And that's very important, particularly for people who have been C-level executives and now they're board members and they think they're just bringing their C-suite work to a boardroom. And so they act like they're a CEO, they act like they're a CFO. And so they ask the same questions of the executives that they would have asked of their directors or their direct reports. And it's not the same. And so until they begin this experienced C-level executive understands that as a board member, they're responsible for the governance of the organization, the care of it, the loyalty to its ability to continue on next year and so forth. And that is their work. Until they understand it, that noses in and fingers out is going to help them get there. It's going to help them grow. But once they're there, We want them to have their noses in and fingers in to the governance of the organization. Otherwise, they're not going to give adequate attention to its charter, to the fact that there needs to be a strategic direction, that there needs to be policies, particularly financial policies that can direct what the director would do. And so instead of saying, here's what I think I would do if I were in your shoes, they're going to be saying, we're creating the shoes. We're creating the policies by which you have to do your work. That's the governance work. So that sets the stage for the executive and operational aspects of the organization, and then how it's going to be measured and reported. So our central point, once we're in that board seat, needs to be the governance of the organization. And the agenda is going to have board related agenda that is not the executive's agenda.
Yes.
And there are a lot of folks who are so strong as business leaders that have not yet grown into what it means to be a governor of an enterprise. So that's a shift in perspective that we want them to gain.
That's I totally get that this shift in perspective from sort of operational execution to strategic oversight. It's a unique opportunity, really, for the board members to champion initiatives that
Yes.
prioritize customer success, because the governance is about ensuring that, like to your point, the organization fulfills its mission, its vision, its strategy. And by staying focused on this alignment and long-term business outcomes, we have found, in our work, that boards can help ensure that the customer-centric strategies remain at the forefront of organizational priorities. So, to achieve this mission, board members, they got to ask these critical questions like you're mentioning. And a lot of times, we also talk about this concept called advantageous excellence. We have found that it's really important for boards to focus on assessing the organization's ability to innovate, adapt, and align the operations with customer needs. You have a strong background in operational excellence and around process. So I'm just kind of curious, when you're sitting in the boardroom, what are the questions you typically ask that are related to strategy, data, operational excellence or processes, and performance management?
Thank you for asking that question. And again, you have developed so much in this regard that I'm glad to know what you're doing. And I can't wait to learn more from you as you go, and as I go from here. When I'm sitting on a board, and let's assume that we're now working off of a one-page plan with supporting metrics so that what's happening in the organization is transparent. That really empowers me as a board member to ask three types of questions. The first are clarifying questions based upon this data. Can you say more? Can you move this forward? Can you give me a little bit more about the context so that I can demonstrate that I understand the data and I'm not going off on a tangent? And neither is any other board member. It keeps us focused on what we need to address. Once we have an agreed upon understanding of what the data is telling us, now we can get to analytical levels of questions. And it's tough to get there if we're not really understanding the same thing, because then we're not in the same conversation. But once we're in the same conversation, we can start to analyze. So now we can get into what's contributing to our success. This is where those customer-centric questions and this customer-centric data can really begin to shine. You can also ask analytical questions like what's contributing to the results that are less than what we want. And you can begin to dig down and get to answers faster. And it makes everybody have to be honest with what we're working on, which is very helpful. And then there's a third level of question. And I feel like we're in a high performing organization and a high performing board where the data we're receiving, we trust because it's accurate. The data that we've considered, we've been able to analyze and begin to say, what do we have here? What might we do? That can get us into forward thinking questions, which is very unique for the board's domain to say, where are we going from here? Not just this year, where do we want to be in 3, 5, 10 years? Where is this organization going to go? And when we have forward thinking questions, we get to ask things like, what do we have here? How does this match to the market's capacity? And we can get into long-term results, not just short and near-term ones. So I just want to make sure that I also say that if I am a board member and I am not getting that kind of information, that doesn't absolve me of my responsibility. I have a responsibility to the stakeholders and shareholders of the organization. They want to know that we're focused for the long term, and that if they're asking me a question, they don't get a song and a dance from me. They get accurate information and they can trust their leadership. So sometimes asking these important questions is not a comfortable thing to do, especially if someone is kind of blowing smoke into the room and hoping that you won't notice. And so to zero in, starting with the clarifying questions, now I've demonstrated to you I understand. Analytical questions, I'm digging down and gaining insight. Forward thinking questions, I'm thinking about the organization's long term performance. That is a board member's responsibility.
Thank you for sharing how to organize the questions. I love these three categories of questions. It was journalist Simon Calkin who is attributed to saying, what gets measured gets managed, even when it's pointless to measure and management, and even if it harms the purpose of the organization to do so. Right? We're all talking about performance management and measures and that old saying. So it's really important to realize that sometimes we can choose things to measure that are actually not good measures. So when you're, on the board, what are the kinds of things you want to measure to determine the success of customer-centric initiatives, particularly against traditional KPIs like growth and profit margins? Like I know there's a lot of financial measures, and people will talk about customer satisfaction, which is not necessarily a very good measure because just
Yeah.
because someone's satisfied doesn't mean they're going to buy from you or buy more from you or recommend you. So, what are some of the things you like to look at in terms of measures?
Well, if we have done the work to identify who our customer is and how we meet a need for that customer or how we fulfill their desire, then we have items that can be showing up in our strategy, our actual plan, and then the resulting metrics that we can measure. So there's like a question under the question. And that deeper one is, who is our customer and how are we going to meet their needs? And what actions are we taking? Now we have the measures. And I want the question about those metrics to match the answers to who is our customer? What do they need? What do they desire? How are we going to meet those needs and desires? Are we on track to meeting them? What are the trends? Those become the kinds of questions that we can ask and the kind of information that is then helpful. There is a second part here, and that is when everything is kind of landed and you have a need to follow through on compensation to those executives that are leading. And so in some way, we want to link those metrics to what the compensation is for those executives. So they're not just thinking about what am I going to get paid, but they're thinking about how are we honoring the customer and the customer journey so that I would be honored to receive the payment that I get. And that becomes the work then of a finance committee. And some boards go one level deeper and create a comp committee. And I don't think a comp committee is doing its job if it gets a real convoluted set of compensational metrics, because that lets those executives, some of whom are really talented people, it actually encourages them to try to game it, to try to steer things for their benefit instead of steering them for the customer benefit. So I then also want to see, is there a nice tight line between executive compensation and that customer experience, customer retention, lifetime value of the customer, and that kind of thing, which is a little bit step above that. Just what did we earn this last year? What was our income this last year?
I'm so glad you mentioned that because I cannot tell you how many plans I see and review, our company receives and review, and almost all of them start off with outcomes around selling, right?
Mhm.
Selling, this is a revenue number. We're going to sell X widgets, Y widgets, whatever. And there's never any mention of the customer
Right.
in what they're in that top level of the business outcomes. So I think it's, staying on this topic is really one of my favorite topics around customer centricity is the performance management component that's related to that, right?
Yeah.
So when you think about those KPIs that are crucial to evaluating customer centricity, things like customer loyalty, customer referral rate, customer retention rate, customer lifetime value, all of those, right? So there's leading indicators, there's lagging indicators like referral rates and retention rates. They can really help predict revenue and profit growth, right? So how do you recommend looking at those kinds of measures?
I do, and I really like making sure we know what our leading indicators are, not just the lagging ones. I like how we can also begin to dig down to what those unique drivers are in a business. So it's not particularly helpful to go up the street and get a sense of how a company next door is doing it because they are in their marketplace doing their thing. And even somebody that you might consider best practices, it's not a matter of just matching their best practices. You want to exceed them, you want to innovate, you want to do it better. And about every organization will have organized itself consciously or unconsciously around what drives that business. And if they can't answer the question about their drivers, then they don't have leading indicators. Just this past week, I spent some time with a business owner. He's got a growing business. He's doing very, very well. And he had a strong intuition about how his business was doing, but he didn't have data to inform him. So we spent the better part of a day. It was the right time for him in his business development as he grows this thing to dig down and figure out what drives his business and what are you going to end up talking about? What the customer wants, what the customer desires, how you deliver that to them. And so we were able to figure out what actually causes the sale, and then begin to say, well, then what metrics do you need? And what's the frequency of measuring them? Do you need to do that daily, weekly, monthly, biweekly? What is it? And it turns out in his particular business that he needs some predictive measures, and there is some predictability if he starts measuring the data. And so now he's putting a system in place, automating some of it that will help him. What I want to say is that each business is different in this regards. In this case, it was a leisure business, but if you're a manufacturer and you've got inventory turns to track or something along that line, or you're offering a counseling service and you have to have a certain number of partnerships that are really well oiled and lubricated where it comes to relationships, or you're not going to get referrals, you have to figure out what behaviors drives that, and you've got to measure that. Otherwise, you're not going to have customers or clients. So getting that figured out specific and germane to the business is a great big win.
I agree. And I love the fact that you're focusing on behavior, customer behavior. That is the right types of things to be looking at as opposed to what they feel or think. Behavior tells us everything. They can feel and think all kinds of things, but we really need to understand behavior. And of course, that comes back to strategy, mission, and
Yes, it
values
does.
again. And that, of course, takes us back to if you're focusing on customer behavior, then you're talking about customer centricity as an organizational model. It's
Mhm.
really about how your leadership team is going to make decisions, how it's really going to run the company, which is what you were basically doing yesterday or the other day with this individual, this business owner. How are you going to run your company? So integrating, customer-centric practices, that's essential to the long-term growth and to the profitability of the company. We've found that in our work, and we're not alone. Many organizations, whether that's KPMG, PwC, Deloitte, all of the big names, they found that customer centricity drives increased lifetime value, improves retention rates, improves referral rates. All of those things are important. So as we move down this idea of customer centricity, which it can be kind of a buzzword. So I'm really thinking, how can we make it tangible and real? What are some of the most effective ways the board and the C-suite members can work together to integrate a customer-centric approach into the business, into the strategy? And how does the board ensure that customer success is treated as a priority?
Oh, what a wonderful question. And it's really at the heart of the matter. And as we've been talking about this today, I'm just struck anew how important sincerity is here. That it's not just faking your way to say, I'm interested in you as a customer because I think it'll get me data that will help me do my job. It is the job of pleasing the customer, providing what the customer is saying they need, and to do it in a way that's sustainable and builds that relationship. So sincerity drives an awful lot of this from the frontline worker all the way up to a boardroom. that we are interested in really acting on this mission that we claim we have, this delivery of a product or a service. When that is in place, then we can actually begin to ask, really, what do we mean by the word customer? Because you have many people who are in some kind of a transactional relationship here. You have employees who are going to get paid for their time. You have vendors who are going to get paid for the service that they bring. You have the person who's purchasing the service or receiving the service or buying the product. And then you have those investors who are stakeholders. And I really like looking at organizations, enterprises, as an ecosystem that involves all of these interchanges where people are coming, believing and trusting that something of value will come their way if they invest something of their time or money or some kind of combination. So, by that broad definition, any stakeholder is a customer of the enterprise. And it is important then that anyone who's responsible for the well being of the enterprise, which is the executive and the board, they need to listen deeply to each of these, within each of these kinds of relationships, because every investor will have their own personal agenda, every customer is going to have their own personal agenda, every vendor is going to have their agenda and their need and why they're coming and what they believe in, and we're going to have to analyze that and put it into some kind of buckets, or we can't get metrics. And we need to do that with that kind of sincerity and care. And that starts from listening, not just telling. And it is out of that listening that we can do that kind of organizing, and we can figure out what might be innovative, what might even be disruptive in a very beneficial way within our organization, or excuse me, within our marketplace. That's the stuff that listening produces, where we can be very customer centric. Otherwise, I'm just using the customer in order to get information from them. That wears very thin very quickly.
You are so right. And an excellent point about listening. And, as an operational excellence expert, I imagine you agree that speed and adaptability are key to being customer centric. And you have
Yes,
to have good listening to make that happen. But you also have to have the right systems, the tools, and processes in place.
yes.
How can boards, Mark, assess whether they have the necessary technology, infrastructure, and processes in place to support customer centricity and this listening?
Oh boy, these questions are great. Um, we're in an age of AI and trying to make sense of that. And there are some really beneficial things about it, such as aggregating data and getting it distilled quickly. Underneath that technology are people, and people have to develop. They can't just offload their brains. They can't just let technology become a substitute for their actually showing up to work and driving things toward the mission. So their desire to listen to people and then use technology is a different approach than to use technology as the means to listen. As a, like, I'm putting that out there to do the listening for me, and then I'm just going to do what it says. I have not directed my heart, my body, my relationship to the customer. And the customer is going to say, this is just one more form of a call center or a set of menus where I can't actually connect, issue my complaint, get it resolved. And the only way they want to hear from me is if I give them data according to the forms that their technology calls for. So the people part of this doesn't go anywhere, and technology used in support of that can make us stronger. It just cannot be a substitute for it. So that means we have to be prepared to develop humans alongside our development of technology. It's not a off or on, it's not either or, it is both, and in support of human development. When we get it the other way around, there's growing abundant evidence that humans actually reduce their capacities, their problem solving skills reduce, their
Yes.
sense of satisfaction goes down, and that's going to translate to customer experience.
I couldn't have said it better. I am so in line with your thinking. We as humans need to be interacting with the humans. The technology is a tool for us to use to help us maybe be more productive, but it is not a replacement for us for
Right.
the human interaction, the human connection. I really appreciate that. So we're going to wrap up.
Okay.
And I'd love for you to give some advice, if you have any, to C-suite leaders who are trying to better align themselves with their board of directors and to better ensure that they are more customer-centric in how they approach their business. Do you have any, kind of wrap up advice?
Well, just one simple thing, because your whole theme here and what you're driving is a customer centricity. And I feel like a lot of my answers have said yes, but, or yes, and. So let me come right back to it to say customer centricity is called that because it has to be in the center. So if we're going to be customer centric, it needs to show up in the actual mission in order for it to be in the values and the strategies and the metrics and the analytics and then the next round of strategy. Then customer centricity becomes what we measure, report, analyze, and continuously improve.
I couldn't agree more. Customer centricity needs to be in the mission. So, Mark, I really appreciate you sharing your insights today and your expertise and experience. As we wrap up, I would like to invite our community, our listeners, to reflect on their own organizations. How can they leverage data and operational excellence to foster a customer-centric culture, drive growth and innovation? How can they use that to better work with their own boards? Many of them have boards. And how can this help boards of directors engage more with their C-suite? And think about what kinds of changes, if any, they need to make. For more insights and strategies for leading with change, I invite people to visit our website and explore our resources designed to help you grow and thrive. And we hope you found this episode of What's Your Edge helpful. What's Your Edge is the creation of Vision Edge Marketing. And since 1999, Vision Edge Marketing has been helping our customers solve the most difficult challenges in using data, analytics, process measurement to accelerate growth, create customer value, and improve performance. We always welcome hearing from you.